Breathe in, breathe out. That's the respiratory system. Inspiration is another way of saying inhale. We're bringing air into the lungs through the diaphragm, which is a thick sheet of skeletal and smooth muscle, which means we have involuntary and voluntary control over it. The intercostal muscles are also involved. They're the ones that insert between the ribs. Air pressure has a lot to do with how we breathe, because normally the air outside of our body, we call that atmospheric air or atmospheric pressure. It's going to follow a gradient of high to low pressure. So what I'm saying here is that oxygen and other gases outside the lungs are going to naturally flow into the alveoli, which are these tiny sacs along the pulmonary capillaries inside of the lungs. Now, lungs are not like a party balloon that just sort of empty out and shrink with each breath. They're surrounded by a pleural sac, and that's going to have these thin sheets of pleura. And in between the sheets are lubricating fluids that allow them to slide past each other. Now, besides keeping the lungs expanded, even when we exhale, the pleura also provides some protection. And only occasionally is that region inflamed. We call that pleurisy. Breathing comes in different stages. The first I'm covering is going to be tidal volume, and it is just like a oceanic tide. It comes and goes. With each gradual breath, we measure it in milliliters. And this is where we often first look when there's an acute respiratory distress, some kind of chronic illness, COPD, asthma. It's going to show up in the tidal and other areas as well. Inspiratory reserve, think of inspire is to inhale. That is where we can breathe past our tidal volume. So normal breath, and then that's our inspiratory reserve. The vital capacity is a culmination of really all the stages that we have control over. It's the maximum milliliters of air that we can move out of our lungs when we expire or breathe out. Residual volume it's the air that we just can't exhale. Okay, there's a certain amount of air that just remains in our lungs, but don't worry, it's not stagnant. You don't have dusty, stagnant air in your lungs, because all the air that enters the lungs circulates. All right. Lung quality indicates respiratory distress. So what I'm saying here is sounds such as ronky. That may be a snoring sound. It indicates some kind of obstruction, sometimes pneumonia, or maybe a child's inhaled a popsicle stick. Get a little ronky there. Stridor and wheezing. If we have a narrowed airway due to a shock or asthma, sometimes you hear these, especially on the exhalation. The ventilation rate refers to the number of breaths per minute, and we use a spirometer to determine the PFT, pulmonary function. And we can graph these to show the lung function at each stage of the cycle. So do you see the diagram there? We're getting some tidal volume happening, liters per minute, tidal volume in, out, and then we'll get a kicker here at some point. Oh, yeah, okay, tidal volume, good little review here. Those are going to be the normal inhalation, exhalation. We measure that, and from that we can determine what the patient's pulmonary function is, right there. Then we want to measure there you go, the high. Does that look familiar? Inspiratory reserve, and that is the amount of air that we can expel forcibly from our lungs. Measure that. On to, now we're down in when we're exhaling, the expiratory reserve, and that's what we have voluntary control over. That's the air that we can expel past the tidal volume. Vital capacity, that is the maximum volume that can be exhaled from the lungs. All right, good review. Controls over breathing. The brain, interesting. The brain is very sensitive to oxygen and especially carbon dioxide, because what carbon dioxide is going to do is change the pH. As CO2 builds up in our bloodstream, our pH drops and we are stimulated to breathe. Now the pons and medulla in the brainstem are the ones that are involved with this. This diagram on the right may look complicated, but I've mentioned some of the parts. The intercostal muscles, there's intercostal nerves. So the impulse is going to travel from the brainstem through the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm. And remember that diaphragm is that apron of tissue that helps to inflate and deflate the lungs. When this happens, we get hyperventilation, which is just rapid deep breathing. And this is done to expel CO2. And as our body expels CO2, our breathing rate slows down because our pH is starting to stabilize and become close to neutral. There are many variations in breathing. Nitrogen narcosis, decompression sickness, the bends, it's all the same thing. When we dive beyond 150 feet, the nitrogen that's normally in our bloodstream, okay, it's there all the time, it's a gas, it's going to dissolve in the tissues and into the cells, which is not bad when you're deep. But if you rise quickly to the surface, suddenly that nitrogen is going to it's going to cluster into the blood so fast that we can't exhale it. And then when bubbles of nitrogen start to form in the blood, we have what's called the bends. A very painful and sometimes fatal situation. Hypoxia, here we have a little example, hypoxia due to high altitudes. So in this case, I mentioned earlier that typically atmospheric pressure is higher outside the lungs, and so we have this passive flow. Well, in high elevations, the pressure within the lungs is higher, so it's difficult for the alveoli to absorb enough oxygen. We have different responses. The first one is shortness of breath, because the body's just trying to accumulate as much oxygen as it can. And we have tachypnea or tachycardia, with the heart's involved as well. And then shortness of breath, which is dyspnea. These guys in the picture, they saved my life. High in the Himalayas, the mountains of Nepal, I had hypoxia. And no matter how good a shape I was in, I couldn't get enough oxygen. So it's one of those things that's hard to train for. You find out sometimes either you got the lungs or you don't. Okay, secondary response, which is frightening. I've never experienced. I always went down the mountain as soon as I got hypoxia. Pulmonary edema, and that's when the plasma from our pulmonary blood vessels, okay, think pulmonary, think lungs and heart, then the lungs start to fill with fluid, and now we can't absorb oxygen because of that fluid. In a way, it's like pneumonia, I suppose. And further on, if the edema is not treated, we go into a very serious PE, pulmonary embolism, and that's where an embolus or a blood clot is going to break free from somewhere in the vascular system, and it starts to block pulmonary blood vessels. So vessels lining the lungs start to fail. Okay, so don't go here.